picture this. You tuck your 2 young children into bed. Later, you're surprised by the pitter-patter of little feet. Who's out of bed now? You mutter to yourself. Setting aside your snack, you head upstairs, only to discover that both of your girls are peacefully asleep. Night after night, the mystery persists until one day when your home construction project reveals something that sparks a chilling realization. Perhaps this hidden discovery had been the cause all along. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. It was May 2016 when the Carner family decided to renovate their 1936 San Francisco home. It was located near the Richard District, which was known for its old city charm. On May 9th, workers began digging up the old concrete in the garage when their shovels hit something hard. Well, that shouldn't be there. When the workers stopped their digging and began to investigate, they discovered a small, ornate box made of lead and bronze. As they uncovered more, they realized it wasn't a box at all, but a coffin. Only 37 inches long, it was clearly made for a child. The coffin had 2 Art Deco glass windows. They cleaned the dirty glass and peered in at the face of a beautiful blonde-haired little girl. With rosy cheeks and red lips, she was almost perfectly preserved in slumber. If the coffin had not been so rusty, they may have mistaken her for having been buried only recently. The young child, who construction workers summarized couldn't have been more than 3 years of age, wore a long white lace dress, and her long blonde hair was decorated with lavender. On her chest lay a cross made of eucalyptus leaves, baby's breath, and roses. She also had eucalyptus laying all around her tiny body, and in her right hand she was holding a single rose. Now, this coffin appeared to be a type of Fisk coffin. These coffins were made out of cast iron and had 1 or 2 glass windows on top so that you could see into the coffin. Fisk coffins were popular in the 1800s among those wealthy enough to afford them. They were designed to be airtight to keep the bugs and rodents out, but also to protect the living. Because the deceased may have passed away from some type of infectious disease, and coffins would often be transported a long distance by railway, so having the coffin be airtight was a good way to ensure that the disease stayed in. There were multiple other reasons why someone might have wanted a airtight coffin, but what they didn't realize at the time was just how well these coffins would end up preserving the bodies inside. Now, as many of these coffins have been pulled up for various reasons, we have seen that even 100+ years later, the deceased would often appear as though they had just died within the last few days. And this was the case with this little girl. Now, of course, once the body is discovered, the construction stops, and one of the homeowners, Erica Carner, contacted the local county coroner, and she got some shocking news. Because the casket was found on private property that she owned, she was told that she was responsible for the body. Like, what? So she was right here.
That's Erica Carner pointing to the spot in her backyard where workmen found an expensive coffin last year. Inside, the well-preserved body of an unknown 2-year-old girl.
So the medical examiner's office, they said they'd come, they'd take a look at the body, but after that, she, as a homeowner, had to figure out what to do with the body. They were kind of like, meh, you could just leave it buried there under your house if you want. So obviously, she wasn't going to do that. So Erica calls around to get a few quotes on how much it would cost to bury a child that wasn't hers. And local undertakers quoted her prices ranging from $7,000 to $22,000. One place quoted her $20,000 just to come and pick the body up, like nothing else, just essentially take possession of the body. $20,000. So these prices, of course, were quite shocking to Erica, and so she realizes that she's going to need a bit of time to try to figure out what in the world she's going to do. So wanting to help her, her contractor builds a box that she places the coffin in, and they put it in her garage. And of course, now that the coffin has been opened by the county coroner's office, the body began to decay quite rapidly. Luckily, about 10 days after the discovery of the body, someone from the investigation thought about the fact that there was a local organization called Garden of Innocence and thought maybe they could help. So Garden of Innocence is a California-based nonprofit that travels to different states and counties to teach people how to care for abandoned and unidentified children in their area. Their website says, once a child is found either abandoned or identified, we take over its care. We give the child a loving goodbye. The moment the county tells us they have a child for our garden, we step forward and do what is right. Now, while I think it is incredibly sad that this type of service is even needed, it makes a little more sense if you have some context for how this could have happened in the first place. During the rapid expansion of San Francisco in the 1800s, they started putting these cemeteries further and further out from the city, thinking surely no one would ever want to live in this remote area so far from the city. But the boom of the gold rush meant the city expanded past their wildest imaginations, and no matter how far out they put these bodies, the city just came up around them. So by the 1890s, the city of San Francisco decided that the dead were just taking up too much land from the living, and they voted to have all burials stopped in the city of San Francisco. So the cemeteries were closed and people would have to be buried somewhere else. By the 1900s, they decided that more room was needed for housing, and officials decided they would need to move the existing cemeteries to get that space back. The Old Fellows Cemetery that borders the area where the Garden of Innocence Bay Area is located was designed to be like a big, beautiful park, which is how many cemeteries were in that era. And many of the people buried in these park-like cemeteries had died penniless and were buried at the city's expense. In 1923, some 30,000 bodies were exhumed and moved to Green Lawn Cemetery in Colma. And during that process, this little girl's body was one that was somehow left behind. Of course, they weren't the best at keeping records back in those days when the bodies were originally buried or later on when they were moved. And so this has resulted in various construction projects being halted over the years when bodies are found. So apparently this is much more commonplace than most of us realize. I found quite a few stories when I was researching this one of like, yep, happened again, happened again. There was a few stories in the 1990s, and the majority of the bodies that were moved from Old Fellows to Green Lawn Cemetery were placed in a mass grave. Over this period of expansion in San Francisco, approximately 150,000 bodies were exhumed from various cemeteries around that area and moved to that same city below San Francisco called Colma. And now I'm kind of wondering how many were actually left behind. And now Colma is considered the city of the dead as it is 2 square miles of cemeteries. And as of the 2020 census, only about 1,500 people live in Colma. The rest is cemeteries. Fast forward to 1936, the home where the Carneys now reside is being built on the land that was previously the Old Fellows Cemetery. And if we fast forward even more, it brings us to May of 2016, where the Carneys now own this home and they want to give it a facelift, which results in them finding this body, which we now know, given a little context, was probably laid to rest somewhere around 130 to 140 years earlier. So Alyssa Davey, the founder of the Garden of Innocence Project, is contacted by someone working on this case thinking, hey, maybe she could help out. And Alyssa is very eager to help out, so she contacts the coroner's office to offer her assistance, and they tell her it's not in their jurisdiction. She needs to contact the homeowner directly. So Alyssa reaches out to Erica Carney, who is very excited to have someone help out with this whole situation. And Alyssa's goal was not only to help the little girl have a proper reburial, but she also wanted to try and determine who she was.
We just fell in love with her and we wanted her to have her name back. She deserves that.
So to honor the sweet child, the women decide that they should name her. Alyssa thought that the name Eve would really suit her, but Erica's 2 daughters, who were 4 and 6 at the time, wanted to name the sweet girl Miranda. So they named her Miranda Eve until they could determine her real identity. Garden of Innocents took responsibility for little Miranda Eve's remains, and several of Alyssa's contacts agreed to volunteer their services in order to give Miranda a proper burial. While the body was in the Garden of Innocents facility, 20 strands of Miranda's hair were pulled and sent to the professor of anthropology at the University of California for DNA testing in the hopes that they could discover Miranda's true identity. On June 4th, 2016, a service was held for Miranda in Green Lawn Memorial Park in Colma. It was attended by approximately 140 strangers who wanted to make sure that this little girl was laid to rest again with the love and dignity that she received the first time. She was left in the casket that her family had placed her in more than 100 years ago and placed inside a new cherry wood casket that one of Alyssa's contacts, the Cooper family, had made for her. Now that Miranda had been laid to rest, Alyssa was determined to figure out her true identity. So during all of this time that Alyssa is arranging and having Miranda buried, the professor of anthropology at the university, along with his team, were running a bunch of different tests on those strands of hair. And first and foremost, he was able to determine that Miranda was in fact a girl due to the lack of Y chromosomes. Now, everyone had assumed that she was a girl because of her appearance, but back in the 1800s, young children were not dressed that different. Both boys and girls wore long dresses and had long curly hair. So that was an important thing for them to establish. Now, her DNA was also able to determine an approximate age of between 2 and 3.5 years old, and they were even able to determine that she had probably been sick for about 10 months prior to passing away. It was determined she had passed away from a form of severe malnutrition that is typically caused by some type of viral, bacterial, or parasitic infection. And while that team was working on the DNA, Alyssa, along with a team of professors, scientists, librarians, private investigators, genealogists, and various other volunteers, searched rural records, plot maps, surveyor maps, cemetery maps, county records, and a bunch of old photos, all in an effort to find out who Miranda was. Among these records, Alyssa was looking for any family that had records of bearing a child anywhere between the ages of 2 and 5 years old. And comparing old street maps of that area with old maps of the cemetery, Alyssa was able to find the plot for the Cook family. And she was also able to determine that the Cook family plot appeared to have been right in the area that was now the Carney family's backyard. This all took about 3,000 hours of research, but Alyssa was pretty confident that she had found the correct family. She believed that Miranda Eve was Edith Howard Cook. She sent all of these family records that she had gathered over to the anthropologist team that were working on the case, and they were able to find a living descendant, an 82-year-old man in Napa named Peter Cook. Peter hadn't known much about his father's side of the family, but he was willing to give them a sample of his DNA so that they could match it up against Miranda Eve's. And in April of 2017, Peter's DNA was positively matched to Miranda's. Peter was pretty excited to hear that he was related to the little girl because he had been following her story on the news. And so once DNA records confirmed his finding, it was determined that Miranda Eve was in fact Edith Howard Cook, daughter of Horatio and Edith Cook, born November 28th, 1873, and died October 13th, 1876, at the age of 2 years and 10 months old. It turns out that Peter Cook was little Edith's brother's grandson, making him Edith's great-nephew. With this information confirmed, the Garden of Innocents was able to raise money for a new headstone for little Edith Howard Cook that now reads with her correct name, dates of birth and death, a note thanking those involved in laying her to rest, and one telling visitors to Google her story to learn more about her. There's also a little rose engraved on the bottom of the headstone and a verse from Amazing Grace. I once was lost, but now I'm found. The Carneys now wonder if it was little Edith's footsteps they heard on their landing all those nights.
I've heard them.
The footsteps have no logical explanation. All of this has gone on for years until the discovery of the coffin.
Have you heard the footsteps since she left?
We have not.